What's up, guys? Today we are on the Green Revolution 5.5. So we're going to get into a little bit more detail, even though we've mentioned the Green Revolution up to this point. So today you need to be able to explain the consequences of the Green Revolution on food supply and the environment in the developing world. This is characterized in agriculture by the use of chemicals and mechanized farming, so modern technology. And we need to also consider that there's positive and negative effects that go hand in hand with the Green Revolution. So the Green Revolution began more or less in about the 1950s, 1960s. Maybe y'all remember from the documentary that we watched in the Population Unit. This was meant to kind of help solve or try to figure out by time to solve the population issue. So essentially the research of more developed countries or MDCs spread to more developing areas like Latin America and Asia. So this ended up causing massive population growth, especially in developing regions of the world. This was already happening, so there's a lot of issues of people starving in various areas. So this was meant to help them while scientists and demographers were trying to figure out what to do about the population boom that was happening. So these techniques were meant to help feed the world's extremely super rapidly growing population. So some characteristics of the Green Revolution. This includes the development of higher yielding, disease-resistant, faster growing varieties of grains like rice, corn, and wheat. So some of the basic crops that we use. This meant that we had hybrids and GMOs, genetically modified organisms, in order to create these kinds of crops. This led to the ability to double crop, which means you're able to grow more than one crop per year, which for us, maybe we don't really think about it, right? We don't really think a lot about our agriculture, but that is like mind blowing for this time period. To be able to grow more than one crop in that single year, that was revolutionary. Because of all these technologies, it meant that people needed to use more fertilizers to keep that soil productive, pesticides to protect some of these plants, also irrigation techniques and machinery, also in developing countries. So for developing countries, this was newer technology for them. Some positive results. So good things that came out of the Green Revolution include higher yields on the same amount of cultivated land. So if we think about like that piece of land, they became more productive. So because of this, we see this pattern. Increased yields of that crop meant that we had surplus or extra food, which then meant that we could sustain population growth, which then meant that we could begin to export some of these crops, right? If they have extras and leftovers, sell it to other areas, which then meant more wealth. And that wealth could then be reinvested into better farming technology, which meant more crops, right? So we see this kind of like circular pattern here. So another element to this was that it led to self-sufficiency in developing areas like Latin America, South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, areas that maybe had some struggle, but through the Green Revolution technologies, they were then able to sustain themselves much, much better. And it lowered food prices, which meant increased access to people who had struggles, right, feeding themselves and their families before. So there are definitely some negative results. Unfortunately, the environment has been receiving a lot of stress on the land, right? From things like chemical fertilizers and pesticides, right? The mass use of these. what happens then is that it runs off into local water systems. So these chemicals get absorbed into the soil, or as it rains, it runs off into different water systems, lakes, rivers, things like that, which then means that there's an impact on local ecosystems, habitats. The water can then become polluted. Animals can then be poisoned as well, unfortunately. Also, this intensive double cropping system needed aggressive irrigation. So they were growing twice the amount of crops every year, all of a sudden, which means that they need more water. So because of these irrigation systems, we see soil erosion, salination, which is like salt then gets into the soil, which then affects how fertile that soil is. Also, we need more machinery in order to continue to increase these yields, right? This means that greater reliance on fossil fuels, more fossil fuels are needed for this type of machinery. And of course, we have air, sound, and water pollution as these agricultural practices expand and become more modern. And of course, with that expansion, that means that there's definitely a loss of biodiversity. So unfortunately, a lot of the negative results kind of focus around the environment. So we also see negative results through gender. Prior to the Green Revolution, in many areas in developing countries, women were the ones that were in charge of farming labor. So that gave them, value and power within their societies. So because of these new technologies, these techniques, right, they tended to be communicated to males within society as opposed to women. And women were then excluded from this learning. They were excluded from having decision making, and then their value in society then decreased. So we see a lack of economic and social equality through this. So this is something that maybe we don't always think about, right? When we think about agricultural technology, and we see a lot of the positives of agriculture, and I think the negatives of agriculture we see are environmental, but there's definitely been negative consequences for women in developing areas. Africa also has had much less success with the Green Revolution than other areas of the world. Africa has a harsh and diverse environmental conditions. So, Africa is an enormous place, right? Many different countries with many kinds of climates. So some of them struggle with drought, some of them struggle with soil fertility. And overall, because of the lack of infrastructure and reliable transportation networks, it was a lot harder for the Green Revolution's positives to be more widespread throughout Africa. African crops also were not included in GMOs at first. So things like sorghum, yams, things like that, they were not some of those crops that benefited from this technology. And then also there was a lack of government investment in order to get that process started. So Africa was definitely left behind at first with this Green Revolution. So make sure you can explain the consequences of the Green Revolution on food supply and the environment, both the positives and the negatives.